Hello and welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 11. Today we're joined by Ben Harshyne, CEO of Huntera Maps. Ben shares how to identify key land features and how maps can help you create better hunting strategies. Hello and welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 11. Today we are joined by Ben Harshyne, map guru and CEO of Huntera Maps. Pretty pumped for the show today for a couple of reasons. One, really looking forward to the conversation with Ben. It's been a little while. I've been trying to get him on the show, so super excited to have him. But also, we are now currently in November, which, as we all know, as deer hunters, November is the month that we kind of look forward to and circle on our calendars as the time to really hit the timber. I know a lot of us have likely been out in the woods for the past month or so, but November is whenever we really kind of crank it up. And I am even doubly excited because I am preparing to leave for my Ohio hunting trip where I'll be spending roughly 10 days in the Buckeye State. I've been planning this for about a year and did some scouting this summer, which I know I shared with you guys on the podcast. And hopefully things will all kind of come to fruition and come to a head while I'm there in the next week and a half, 10 days. But with all that being considered, I think we probably should just kind of cut to the chase today and get on the phone with Ben and see what he has to share with us. Before we get Ben on the line, let's take a quick break for a word about our partners at Exodus Outdoor Gear. In today's Exodus experience, we'll hear from Exodus trail camera user Josh Fowler about why he's made the switch to Exodus and why he's a believer in Exodus trail cameras.
So I currently have about 16 trail cameras. So I'm familiar with all of the brands. I initially heard about Exodus on a hunting podcast. And at the time, I was running all these various cameras. And one of the founders, Matt, was talking about Exodus, and it just struck a chord with me. Everything he was saying about their camera and how they do things differently hit the nail on the head for me. I found out they were actually going to be at that Harrisburg show this past February. So my plan was to go up there and stop and talk to Matt and pick up one of the cameras at their show. Yeah, it's a much more rugged camera. You first hold it and you can immediately tell it's better built than most cameras. It's actually reinforced with metal components rather than all plastic. Their vertical hinge design on the bottom with the latches on each side actually helps prevent water ingress, which is, a game camera's number one enemy. If you were creating a list of all the important things you're looking for when you purchase a trail camera, Exodus checks all those boxes. The reliability, the support, the rugged design, the quality components, the excellent 5-year warranty, and their theft replacement policy. So they're pretty unique value propositions exclusive to Exodus. So it didn't take me long to become a believer and to be a big advocate for what they're doing.
And that, my friends, is an Exodus experience. If you'd like to learn more or make the switch to Exodus trail cameras yourself, visit them at exodusoutdoorgear.com. All right, we are back, and we are joined by Ben Harshyne of Huntera Maps. Ben, it's been a little while coming. I've been wanting to get you on the podcast. I'm super stoked to have you on and glad you could make some time to jump on and talk all things Huntera, maps, and deer strategies that are related. But first, before we dive into all the good details, how are you doing, sir?
Doing well. I appreciate you guys having me on the podcast for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely stoked to have you on. I've watched a couple of your YouTube videos, got a little bit familiar with what you guys do. Of course, been perusing your site. I actually listened to you on a separate podcast, and truth be told, it was one of those things where I really hadn't, I'll be completely honest, geographic and maps were not my strong suit in school. And actually, if I'm being real honest right now, you guys actually, this podcast saved me from a variety of embarrassment in front of my daughter while I was trying to refold up a sleeping bag. So I'm appreciative in many ways that we are doing this podcast this evening. But before
I'm sorry, honey, Daddy has business to do.
Yeah, exactly. But before we dive into the good stuff, Ben, if you wouldn't mind, just give us a little, I know a little bit about you, of course, but if you wouldn't mind, just give us a little bit of background about yourself, where you're from professionally, and then what you also do, of course, in the hunting world.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll just start from ground zero here. I was born and raised in Western Pennsylvania, Indiana County specifically. And I spent my whole childhood there, and then I ended up I ended up going to school at Penn State for 5-year plan, and I know that you guys are from you guys are from Pennsylvania as well, so it's always good to reconnect with my Pennsylvania hunting brothers. But anyways, I went to Penn State, and as far as how I really started to get into mapping, it was right there in school, and I was actually struggling really, really bad through calculus classes in undergrad, and my advisor basically pulled me aside, and he said, "Man, you're going to have to figure something else out. If you want to be an engineering major, you're going to need to figure math out or find another plan." So I started taking some other courses, and I got into a course basically entry to GIS, so spatial analysis and cartography, and basically just understanding maps and geography, and I absolutely loved it, and it really changed my college career around. So I graduated with a degree in GIS, but my real focus was really not on remote sensing or development or analysis. It was making good-looking maps and designing them, and I eventually got a job out of school as a contractor in Washington, D.C. area, making maps for the military and the intelligence community. And I spent essentially 6-7 years in the Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. I had a pretty awesome job making maps for basically finished intelligence products. And I'm sure this kind of will lead into another question you were going to get at, but essentially, we were in 2000 and let's see here, 2010, and I made a map for my dad for Father's Day. Being that I'm from Western Pennsylvania, I really have never hunted any agriculture at all. So if you would look at the property that I grew up hunting, it is essentially just a sea of green. So if you look at it from Google or any other aerial map, it really doesn't tell you too much. And I figured out a way to really visualize the terrain on that property, so you could see all the elevation changes, kind of in it was crude, but it's still a 3-dimensional way. And that was a Father's Day gift to my dad, and it really turned into a game changer for how we approached that property as bow hunters. And I literally grew up there. In Pennsylvania, you can start hunting when you're 12 years old, and I thought that I knew. We both kind of thought that we knew that property like the back of our hand. But when we could see it all right there, that really changed the way that we approached some of our stands and also some of our stand locations. And that was really right when I was starting to get into bow hunting a little more hardcore. And that map kind of proved to be a game changer. So that was really essentially the beginning of Huntera, and from there it really kind of just grew organically with making maps for my dad's friends, and then word of mouth kind of spread and their friends, and next thing you know, I'm making a little pocket change for hunting season,
right,
and some trips we would take in the fall. And I was still working my full-time job in Northern Virginia, but really, eventually, after about a 3-year span, I had to adjust my work schedule, and my wife came aboard and started helping me out with Huntera. And it got to the point where we really were faced with a decision whether we were going to commit to Huntera or if we were going to stay down that Northern Virginia, Beltway burner pipeline. And it was really a no-brainer. I really truly believed in the maps that we were making were kind of groundbreaking for hunters, really being able to see that terrain in addition to the cover of your ground. And we decided to basically pack up and move to the Midwest. I'm obviously a fanatical whitetail hunter, and it was really a golden ticket out of DC and into the heart of the Midwest, where we do a ton of business for people. Obviously, it's a big part of my lifestyle being a hunter. I'd like to be a landowner someday. So I'm one of the fortunate ones that had a great reason to move to Iowa. So that's where we're at today, and that's basically, start from ground zero to I'm 32 years old, and we've been here for 2 years now. So
nice. Yeah, I've tossed around the question to my wife about moving to Iowa, but she was less than interested, shall we say, in moving to Iowa. Well, I started with Montana, so I might have started off a little hot on that topic. But
so that's kind of a win-win there, going to Iowa and doing the Huntera business. I mean, you're kind of in the heart of whitetail country and get some monsters out there.
Yeah, definitely. I've been hunting the Midwest for over a decade now. Really focused on Illinois initially. Made one of my best friends in my life. Met him out here, and my dad and I started hunting with him, and really hunted Illinois a good bit, and then we started to travel into Kansas a little bit. So I never really hunted Iowa until I became a resident here. And actually, the first year that I moved here, there's stipulations on how long you are a resident.
Right.
The DNR really is serious about who's a resident and who's not, so that nobody milks the system. So I wasn't even really able to hunt my first year I was here. But I've got 2 seasons in here now, and they have been well, this is my second season, but last year was truly my most rewarding season, and I did not kill a deer. So, it's great to be out here, and they're certainly not around every tree. That's fact.
Right.
There's some unpressured ground, and when there's unpressured ground, you have a better chance of controlling the stakes of what you're doing and how you're affecting the deer that you're competing.
Sure, absolutely.
So how's your season been this far so far in 2016?
This season has been it's been good so far. Last year I chased a specific deer. I got access to a great property here. It's essentially a cattle farm. It's basically a big draw that goes that cuts across the center of the farm, and it's CRP to the north and south, and there's cows in there in the summertime. Thankfully, this farmer doesn't like to leave the cows in there too late into the fall. So what you get with that is basically a pretty, as far as mature deer, I really wasn't getting much on camera in the summertime last summer or this summer.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm starting to see a pattern. When those cows come out and the crops start to get cut around, this farm really kind of transitions into a fall hunting farm, and I'm okay with that, not getting pictures in the summertime and then seeing, different bucks show up right around October. So
right.
Last year I chased an awesome buck. I actually named him Pork. My dad's nickname is Pork, and him and I sat together. My very first sit here in Iowa, October 2nd. He was here working on helping me work on the basement of the house I bought. And we decided, let's go sit together. And I mean, sure enough, we encountered this deer opening night, and basically just a real high, clean 10, but heavy duty as far as body size. And so I named him Pork. It was pretty fitting. And I ended up encountering him from the beginning of the season into postseason 8 times. So I encountered him 6 times hunting, and then 2 times when I was on the property not hunting. And so I had a lot of confidence that he survived the winter, but in the summertime running these cameras, I just could not pinpoint him. And interesting enough, and this is kind of one of the cooler things that's ever happened to me in my hunting career, I set a camera for this deer. The first picture I got of him was October 7th, about 10:30 at night on this one scrape. So in late September, I set a camera there in that specific part of the farm for him, thinking maybe he'll come back if he's habitual. And I couldn't even believe it when I checked the cards on the 10th. He came literally 365 days and 1 hour earlier than when I first got a picture of him. He showed back up. So October 7th, 9:30 at night. So as far as I'm concerned, it's game on. I've got him on 4 cameras now on the farm. I've yet to see him in daylight, but I'm going to be putting all my chips into to putting this specific deer down. It's a great learning experience.
Nice. Yeah, I have there's one on our farm. I call him Dirty Harry. He's a big wide 6-point, for Pennsylvania. He's not super heavy in mass, but he's probably the oldest deer. I've mentioned him on previous podcasts. He's probably the oldest deer we have on the farm. I aged him last year at about 3.5. I'm assuming he's probably 4.5 this year if I was correct. And as you know from being from Pennsylvania, if you get a deer that's 3.5 years or older in PA, that's an old deer for this area. And he shows up usually this coming weekend. So I have some cameras placed where I caught him last year during this weekend, hoping that he's as you mentioned, habitual and kind of slides by that same around that same date, because then I know kind of what he uses as far as his travel corridors once he hits our farm. So then I'm hoping later here during the second week of the season I can hopefully get on him. So that's the hope at least.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see. It almost blows your mind, but you think these deer, when they become, especially in Pennsylvania, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, and out here in Iowa, 5, 6, 7, they've survived. Mm-hmm. They're survivors, and they're doing things in their life that's keeping them alive. Why change that up unless they're pressured to change it up? So it's wild to think, but it also makes a lot of sense. So good luck. What's his name? Dirty Harry, you said?
Dirty Harry, yeah. Well, since I'm Great Clint name. And I was named after Clint Eastwood, I went Dirty Harry. So, all right. So you mentioned a couple things there that I wanted to kind of touch on. So the one thing that I thought was interesting was, the fact that the way things kind of kicked off with Huntera was you were making your dad a gift, and that's awesome. That speaks to like our hunting heritage, through and through. That was, you started this outdoor company, based on building your father a gift, who I'm sure is the one who kind of got you into hunting and was a big part of, what kind of started you down this path. So, but the one thing that struck me was, it was a question that I have, because this year I'm branching out for the first time for whitetail, at least to a different state, and going to Ohio and hunting some public land. So primarily the land that I've hunted in Pennsylvania has been a family farm of ours, and I'm intimately knowledgeable of pretty much every nook and cranny of that farm. But what struck me was when you said the piece of land that you've been hunting most of your life, with your dad, and you built this map for him, and it just allowed you guys a different perspective of this land that you thought you knew, and it opened up so many different doors or different ideas about how to potentially hunt that land. Can you talk a little bit about that and how valuable these types of maps you're creating can help a hunter who is hunting the same land year over year, and how they can bring new learnings to life using these types of maps?
Sure. And I don't necessarily want this to be a huge product pitch as much about Huntera as it is about using maps to become a better hunter. But
right.
Essentially what we do is in the foundation of really how this all started is being able to show, when you look at an aerial map, it only tells you so much, and it's telling you the cover, what is on the ground and what is growing from the earth on that property, whether it's trees, pasture, field, there's a stream there's roads and houses. It's a picture, and that's critical. But there's another dimension to that is even more critical, especially whenever it comes to habitat that maybe from a vegetation perspective doesn't have as much diversity, and that's being able to pinpoint and understand terrain and how the elevation changes on a property are affecting an animal's decisions on how to move about it. So really our goal with Huntera is to combine a high resolution current image of your property and then add terrain into that. And there's a couple ways that we show that terrain. One is with shadowing. Essentially, we make a 3D model and then we put the two together. So you can naturally see, without being an expert map reader, you can naturally see the ridge lines and the ditches and drainages and saddles, benches, flats, all the elevation change. You can look at that map and understand that place is higher than this area over here. And then on top of that, and this was really a game changer a couple years ago when we launched this new feature, is the ability to add topo contours at really fine defined intervals. And from the beginning, when I was growing up, I'm consuming all this information that I can get my hands on to become a better bow hunter. And the common theme that was popping up is the experts saying you've got to get an aerial map, and you've got to get your standard USGS topo map and try to look at one and then correlate that with the other. And die-hard hunters can no doubt do that, but when we put it all together and make that hybrid, that really was a huge game changer to be able to deliver the ultimate package for the hunter to understand not only where your cover funnels are, which we'll get into, and the habitat features that are going to have an animal move through a property, but also the terrain features and the terrain funnels that are going to alter movement as well. So that was really the foundation of and the problem I was trying to solve with my business was to be able to put that all together in one cohesive package, and that is your go-to. If you're a hunter, this is your go-to map.
Right. So when we're talking about aerial, I guess aerial would be the Google Maps version, right? Just to make sure that we're
So just a mapping 101. Your aerial that people talk about is what you see on Google Earth, Google Maps, Bing. You go to the county to get a map from your courthouse. It's going to be most likely a black and white picture. That's your aerial map. It's literally an airplane flies over the ground and takes pictures. It's a picture of the Earth, or on Google's case, it's satellite image. Mm-hmm. There's satellite image sources as well. So it's just literally a flat picture of the Earth. And then aside from that, when we talk about topo maps, that is not a picture per se. It's literally a set of lines that, when compiled together, show you elevation measurements on the property. So one line that goes around that's connected is all a line of the same elevation, and then the next line is a difference in elevation. So when you start to look at the topo map, you can start to see patterns where if the lines maybe are tighter together, that's drastic elevation change in a short amount of distance, and as opposed to if those lines are farther apart, it's more of a gradual elevation change. Mm-hmm. So those are really kind of the two that we're talking about here: aerial versus topo.
Okay. So I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, my map and geographic skills weren't great. So, and I think this might be helpful for listeners too. It's like, what if we just take a scenario or a situation as if we're going to hunt a piece of property that, that you've never been to, and let's start kind of like from the beginning, and I guess kind of walk us through, I guess, first how you're using these maps to plan your hunts, and what are you looking for, whenever you're looking at these maps.
Sure. And that's a big question, but I guess I'll kind of take a stance at how I approached this piece of property when I got access to it a couple years ago. And really the things you want to look for, the goal when you look at a map is really to try to pinpoint a handful of different things. One, you want to just start to understand where is there change. And when I talk about change, that's change in habitat type, that's change in elevation, that's change as far as where you think deer would feel safe as opposed to where maybe they're being pressured. So if you're in the middle of farm country, you're maybe not as affected as if you're looking at a map and you're hunting more of a suburban feel. So I look for change, and a lot of times the word edge comes up when we're strategizing as bow hunters. Edge and change kind of goes hand in hand. Right. Edge is really where it's literally the defined area where there's change. So that can be the edge of where timber meets a hardened agricultural field. It can be where old grown-up pasture meets maybe more of a cleaned up kind of CRP area. It can be literally as harsh as a fence line that's cutting through the middle of a big open area. It can be where And this is where edge kind of comes into my world a little bit more, where there's terrain change. Mm-hmm. So right away I look at the map and I'm just trying to literally circle and identify where are there differences on the property and where is there consistencies. And those differences, or that edge, is really important to me, because just animals in general, especially whitetails, prefer change and prefer edge. Yeah, I mean, how many times have you sat there and watched the field edge, instead of those deer coming right out the middle of the timber and coming straight out into the field, they use the edge for concealment, or they use the edge for some sort of communication, whether maybe it's with scrapes, or they're just starting to get comfortable and stretch themselves until they get out into the open. So I'm looking right away at okay, where are these areas that could be of interest to deer from a movement standpoint. So that goes with habitat changes and cover, looking at the aerial features of the map, and that also goes in line with the terrain features as well. When you have a map that has topo lines on it, you can start to see where your steep changes are, and then your more gradual areas are, and we can get into those features specifically and how you hunt them. So I'm looking for change, and then another thing I'm looking for is access. You can have a smoking property. One of the issues I specifically deal with on the farm that I'm on, I don't have access from any place other than the road that is the north line of the property. Mm-hmm. So regardless of how beautiful and how gnarly and thick and how great of a hunting farm that is to the south of that road, the fact is I can only approach those areas certain ways. So when I look at the map, I'm really trying to understand, okay, once I start to pinpoint where I'm seeing some interesting places on the map that I would like to scout, and that's a big part of all this. The map is not the only answer, but what I'm looking for is how am I going to literally walk around this property and access it? So that's another big thing, and whether you have a property right now that you just got access to, or you're looking for properties, or maybe you're scouting up a couple different pieces of public ground that you're going to go on a rut vacation with, and you want to make, you want to pick the right one that's going to allow you, good success and good entry and access is huge. Right. So those are really kind of the two things right off the bat that I look for. And then once I start to understand, okay, these are where areas I'm going to have to access the property, which means this is where I'm going to be putting pressure. I really try to understand what areas do I want to go look at and ground truth what I think would be interesting, Right. So that's really been my process for a while. And alternatively, the property that I hunted in Pennsylvania, I grew up on, when I made that map, I was already 10 years deep into hunting that property with my dad, and he had, we had sets that were growing into the tree. I mean, it had been there for so long. Right. But I'm looking at, once we looked at that map, we understood, man, that ridge doesn't really quite run exactly west. It's running more northwest, as silly as that sounds. You know, we can finally see that the way that ridge kind of curls around. And if we were hunting maybe a specific stand on a straight west wind, and now that we understand how that ridge goes a little bit differently than what we thought, we're altering, maybe making small tweaking adjustments. So it's all really about just being able to look at that map and determine how you're going to attack that specific property. Right.
You'd mentioned, I guess, two things throughout our conversation so far, and one was elevation change, and how you might suggest whenever you're looking at the maps and reading the topo lines specifically, how you would kind of, in looking at those, kind of figure out what area you might want to be heading to, or what area might be a good area, and how deer would use that specifically. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. Before we get into that, what I'll do is this is a wild example, and I've used it before, but it works really well. And I think what's really important is that we as hunters are all calling features the correct features, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard a guy explain, this is a draw, or this is a saddle, or this is a spur, and it's not the same terrain feature than maybe what my other buddy was talking about.
Right.
So if you, just to give you another kind of adding on to that map 101 that we talked about earlier, if you would make a fist like you're going to punch yourself in the face, and this sounds insane, but if you do it, we can start to lay out some of the major terrain features that are important to us as hunters. So basically, if you're looking at your fist, all of your knuckles that are in line, okay, that whole set of your knuckles there, that would be a ridge line. So that's going to be the highest area. That's going to be the highest stretch of ground that extends in one area. As you go from each knuckle, which is the highest at its specific part, is a hill, and we all know what a hill is.
Right.
That's pretty easy. But then in between those hills, and this is really where we started to get really successful in Pennsylvania, start to identify what is called a saddle. Mm-hmm. Saddle is going to be that low spot in between where your hills are. So in between your two knuckles where it dips down, that's a saddle. I can identify one specific saddle that we set up on after that map, and we both killed bucks for that same year. So, nice. So there's your saddle, and whether you're in Pennsylvania or you're in Kansas or you're in Iowa, from if you're hunting a saddle, most likely there's going to be a draw coming off of that, and that draw is basically the crease that's in between your two fingers that come off the side of that saddle that's in between your knuckles. So that would be your draw, and those draws are essentially drainages that you'll see in hilly ground or ground that has elevation change. Water, when it rains, it has to go somewhere, and it eventually through time carves its way off the top of the ridge, and it drops down into what is called a draw, and it just continues to carve. And some people refer to them as ditches as well, because sometimes they can be really, really drastic. So right. Drainage, a ditch, a draw, it's really kind of all the same thing. And then what's interesting, though, and these can be some pretty smoking hot places to set up. On each side of that drainage or that draw is going to be a spur. And a spur is essentially, a lot of people call it a secondary ridge. It's basically a little ridge that comes off the side perpendicular of a main ridge. So this is probably a lot to grasp if you're listening to it. But if you look at your hand, it can tell you a lot about what terrain features can be valuable to you as a hunter. Obviously, the side of your hand, which is straight up and down, that's a steep drop off. That's going to be a cliff. Okay, cliffs can be. There's a specific cliff that I identified this year on my property that I'm going to set a stand up, and it's going to be more of a run and gun because it's so deep, and I would be affecting so much if I would go in there and try to hang it now and then hunt it a couple weeks from now. That cliff, though, is basically drops off, and there's a creek bottom there, and it's just a big rocky shelf, essentially. And by default, when you see something like that, animals cannot. They're either going to commit to one side of it or the other. That can be really beneficial for you to understand where you're going to see a solid pinch point, So those are the main terrain features. I'm not sure which one you want to dive into specifically. I mean, you guys are hunting. Your properties are probably a lot of rolling hardwoods, and you're probably hunting some agricultural land as well, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, our farm is just for background for you is just about 240 acres, and I'd say 40 of that is tillable, and there's a mountain on one side, and we have. It's kind of funny. I was looking at my fist as you were talking through, and I was looking and identifying each feature on the farm, and you pretty much hit every one of them. And I've seen deer and have had success in those specific areas that you're talking through. But yeah, you're correct. It's like we're hunting a lot of, at least my area is a lot of, big timber. There's agriculture, but there's not agriculture like there is out in the Midwest. Sure. Nothing to that degree. So, I mean, now that we've identified the different land features and habitat features that we might want to look for on a map, let's talk a little bit, I guess, about how we might use those land features to set up to hunt and talk about how deer use each of these features. Sure.
Well, I guess we would probably start off with where, of those features, when we talk about a ridge, we talk about a spur or a draw, like where would a good spot be once you identify one on the map? And when you're looking at your fist, that doesn't help you when you're looking at your map. So I'll explain a little bit about what does that look like on a map, those features. So your ridge line, if you're looking at a topo map, the only way you're going to be able to tell terrain features on a map is by looking at a map that we would make, or you're looking at a traditional topo map. Either way, there's going to be topo lines on there. And what you're looking for with a ridge is essentially lines that are kind of running all in a straight line together throughout like the region of the property. So not a very tiny specific spot. That would probably be more a spur. I guess ridges can be really small, but in general, you're going to have a main ridge line that's part of the property. So those lines are going to be all running together, but eventually on each side of that ridge, it's going to start to drop off. And at the end of that ridge, at that point, it's going to start to drop off. So where I look, and this kind of goes back into if you're thinking from a change or an edge perspective, where is there change on a ridge? And really where I would say one of the most interesting places on that is at the very end of a ridge, where it comes to kind of a point and it all starts to drop down at one time. And really what you'll see is those lines running together, but once they get to the head of that ridge, the lines will curl around. So you'll basically see like the end of the finger of the ridge, and those lines will probably get a little bit tighter as it drops downhill, signifying an elevation change. Those points can be pretty deadly, especially because when you're at the top of a ridge or almost at the top, you can get a pretty darn good, you can get a consistent wind. So you look at your weather app, or you watch, you understand what your wind is going to be for that night or for that morning, and the end of those ridges or on top of the ridge, you're probably going to get a consistent wind, which is really important from an access perspective, but also throughout the day, you know what your wind is going to be doing. So if you're hunting the trail, and a lot of times when you look at the end of that ridge, you'll see trails on either side of that ridge basically meet at that point. So you got deer on one side of the ridge, and then if they tried to look over, they'd be looking into the side of the hill or the ridge on the very other side of that, where they couldn't see. There's probably another trail where deer run. At the very end of that ridge, where it meets a point, there's probably going to be an area there where those trails cross, and that can be a pretty dynamite spot. Now, along that ridge, and we talked about the knuckles, you're eventually going to have rises and falls along that ridge corridor, and anywhere it drops is really called we call that a saddle. The way you identify that on a map is depending on how drastic the saddle is. There can be hills really in between them. So you might see like a round area. You're looking at your main ridge and you identified that, and then you might see circles or areas that seem like the lines kind of come up and all gather around a specific area, and then it looks almost like an hourglass in between that and another hill. Well, those round areas are the highest points on that ridge. Those are the main hills, and then in between is a saddle, and it almost looks like an hourglass. So if you're looking at the top of a map and you can identify where there looks like lines come together and pinches in the middle, like a bottleneck or an hourglass, that's a saddle. And by default, or by their nature, whitetails are pretty lazy creatures, and sometimes whenever they want to get from one side of the ridge to the other side, instead of going all the way to the end or climbing the steepest spot, they're just going to use that saddle. There's no need to waste energy. If they walk a little bit farther, they may not burn as much energy trying to get to the other side by climbing a steep grade. So those saddles can be pretty dynamite too, and what's neat about those is you can set up either side of that saddle. If you've got enough stands, or if you've got maybe a climber, you can identify, okay, here's the saddle. If I've got a south wind, I can get on this side of the saddle for the trail that's coming across, or vice versa. I can get on the south end if I've got a north wind. So those saddles can be pretty interesting too, and they can be pretty deadly primarily through, depending on where your bedding is and where your food is, and what time of the year you're hunting, those saddles can be pretty dynamite. So
would there ever be an instance, because you just mentioned setting up your stand locations on either end of the hourglass, but in an hourglass shape you would pinch in the middle. Would that then, I guess, create a natural pinch point there that you might maybe consider on the correct wind, of course, kind of sitting in the center of that? Or is that kind of a no man's land area?
Yeah, it definitely can be. I think, and this kind of gets into really micromanaging that specific part of that specific stand site. Mm-hmm. Some saddles can be 30 yards wide. Some saddles might be 70 or 80 yards wide. I would look for those saddles that are tighter, that are more confined, that are maybe going to inhibit a little bit more of a drastic or specific movement through. So that all of this, what we're talking about, is really the idea of funnels, pinch points, bottlenecks. They're all the same concept. Basically, What we're looking for are features that deer are going to use because it's easier to get from A to B.
Right.
So
we kind of walked through how you would identify a saddle on a map. So if we're talking about draws, and I'm going to go back to the lesson you just gave me, so the draws then would be the areas that would be below the saddles running in between two ridges, correct? Or it would be like a drainage cut or something of that nature, right?
Yeah.
So how would we go about identifying those particular features on a topo map?
Yeah, so those are going to be really pretty easy to see if you've got any. If you identify your main ridge, those drainages or draws are going to be coming off the side perpendicular or near perpendicular, kind of against the grain of way that ridge is running. And it's almost going to look like, depending on how drastic that draw is, it's almost going to look like a bird's beak is jutting into the side of that hill. It's going to be a really hardened, almost V shape, going along all the way up until it meets the very top of that ridge, and it's going to be the tightest right there. It's literally going to come to a point or like an arrow. So I always kind of describe it as a bird's beak because it can be pretty long, and essentially that runoff and that draw and drainage is going to get wider as it goes downhill. So if you can identify, this is my ridge and my one high elevation, and then, I can tell that those lines are starting to drop down over the hill. And just by looking at your aerial, there's a river down there, or there's a creek. And then, on the other side of that creek, which is always going to be the lowest part of your property, the other side of that creek is going to start to go back uphill. You can start to really understand, okay, this is the way that this property lays. And coming off the side of that ridge, whether it's a draw or a bench, which is what we haven't talked about a bench yet, which is
you just read my mind.
Yeah, this leads into the bench, which can be a dynamite spot especially when you're hunting in the timber. But those draws, before we get off that subject, is going to look like a beak, and a lot of times what you'll see are trails. Depending on how deep and drastic those ravines, that ravine is in that draw, a lot of times you'll see a trail at the very head of it. So it may be off the side of the ridge a little bit, but right where it meets that peak, you're going to see probably a pretty defined trail going around that thing. So deer don't just want to drop down into a ditch and then come back to the other side. I've seen plenty of deer do that. In fact, the buck that I chased last year, I grunted him over, and he did not use the easy way, which is, up, around, and then back down. He literally jumped over the ditch because he was the man. But in general, these deer will, if they're not pressured and they're just kind of going about their business, they'll probably use the head of that draw to move. A lot of times you'll see trails on each side of that draw as well. And you can almost treat that draw as its own creek bottom, where maybe there's really sharp, drastic cliffs on the edge of that draw, but there's one part where it's maybe a little more gradual, where it's a little easier for them to get from one side or the other, especially if they're down low. You can maybe find a crossing down there, and that can be interesting as well. So that's the draw, and then that kind of leads right into our benches, which sounds like you wanted to talk about. That bench is basically a flat area on the downward slope coming off a ridge or coming off a hill. So you'll be seeing, if you're looking at it perpendicular, you'll be seeing a pretty drastic drop and then a flat area. And then it drops again. And that flat area is really like where I grew up hunting, on those flat areas, back in the day, whenever they logged the property, those were always old logging roads.
Yeah.
So you guys are in the same habitat as that. I mean, those are probably old logging roads, or if you know a property was logged in the past, those are probably going to be areas literally carved on the side of a hill that provides, and it might only be 8 or 10 feet wide, a flat area. From a bedding perspective and from a travel perspective, that is good for deer, especially mature bucks really like to bed on any sort of flat surface for them. So that bench, if you're looking at it, if you say, okay, I know what a bench looks like, from the ground, but what does it look like from a map? If you're looking at these lines and you see them nice and tight coming off that ridge, it's a good significant drop in, and you see those lines start to spread apart more. That's signifying less elevation change along a distance. That's going to be your flatter area, and on the other side of that, you're probably going to see some tight lines again. So if you can identify a bench, you got a great spot to be able to hunt, again, either side of that bench, depending on your thermals, which gets into a whole new conversation. But
you read my mind again, because I was literally going to make mention that, because one of the things I've heard in the past is that deer, of course, like to use benches, but bucks will usually have or mature bucks will usually have what some folks who I talk to refer to as like a buck trail that is maybe 30 yards, 40 yards above that bench, because they don't really want the social activity of being around the does and the fawns that are using that bench, but they want to be up above them in the morning to catch the thermals to see if there's any hot does using that bench.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody listening that doesn't know what a thermal is, essentially whenever the sun rises in the morning, no matter how cold it is or how warm it is, when the sun rises, it heats up the atmosphere. And whenever the atmosphere heats up, by nature, that air current can go uphill, literally go up and rise. On the other hand, whenever that sun drops down over the horizon, the air starts to cool, getting ready for the night, that air and that current drops downhill, so it falls. When you're hunting the side of the hill, you really need to pay attention to that, because, like, say you're set up on a bench. Well, if you're hunting from if you're hunting a specific trail in the morning, and you know that sun is going to be heating up the air currents, I mean, aside from what the wind is doing, the thermals are going to be playing into this as well. So if you're off the side of a hill, chances are you're not getting as drastic of a wind or as heavy of a wind as you would at the top of a ridge. So those thermals are going to be playing an important role in this. And as that sun is heating up the atmosphere, if you're hunting a trail that's, let's just say, right in the middle of a ridge to keep it simple, you're on the top side of that trail. You're uphill from that, because that air current is going to be traveling uphill, and anything on that deer trail that's right below you is not going to be able to smell you. On the other hand, if you're hunting a bench on the evening, you want to be on that the edge of that bench downhill a little bit, so you can still get a shot at the trail. But whenever that sun is dropping down over the horizon, and that air is cooling, it's heavier and it's dropping downhill, and you're going to have a better chance at not letting your scent creep across that bench because it's dropping down behind you. So thermals play a big part in all of this, and I read about them for a long time, and I'll never forget the first time I really truly understood a thermal. It was my first years as a bow hunter. I was 18 or 19 years old, and I remember we got the best stand on the whole property, my dad and I. It's called Skyscraper. We've had tremendous success on this stand, and it's an big old maple tree. And I was sitting there one morning. It was really cold, and the sun came up. It's November. You're just glad to be alive as a bow hunter. And
right.
The sun is blasting, and that sun is finally hit me. If it's warm, it's warming me up a little bit. And I'm just looking, and the maple trees seem to hold their leaves a lot longer than some of the other hardwoods, and some of the other hardwoods in the forest. And so this big branch is extending out, and it's got a bunch of leaves on it still, and I'm just watching this branch, and it's just rising slowly. It's almost like it's just floating. It just rises, and then about 10 seconds later it just drops. and then it just and there was virtually no wind, and I'm looking at that thing like, this is unbelievable, and that's exactly what was going on, was the thermal. So that air was heating up, and it was literally coming from the bottom of the hill, just everywhere where that sun was starting to warm up the atmosphere, was bringing everything back uphill. So you got to pay attention to those thermals, especially when you're hunting terrain.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a really cool nature lesson right there. You had it live and in front of you. That's most folks don't get to see it kind of play out right in front of them. And when things like that play out like that, just, you know, hunting in general, whenever things play out in front of you, you know, how much more do you take away from that experience for the next set?
Yep, no doubt.
So there was one thing that you mentioned there that I wanted to touch on. It was when we were talking about the saddles and the hourglass, the shape, and we were talking about maybe you place a stand in the middle of that, and you'd mentioned, you know, that was really getting down into the granular of micromanaging that specific location. But what I wanted to ask was, how important is it to use both a micro and macro view of a property whenever you're either planning a hunt, or whether you're kind of determining what property you may hunt if you have options between the two?
Yeah, so the idea of micro and macro is really important as a hunter here. So when we talk about macro, it's really how does the area that you want to focus on, or just in general, how does that specific property fit into the bigger scene? Right. And like for example, this farm I'm on here, I really dialed into it because it was really, from a travel perspective, the center of attention in what they call, I mean, out here they're called sections, which is a square mile, 640 acres. But in the surrounding sections of this property, so we're talking square miles, this is the biggest timber and the most kind of the center of attention for the travel. If a deer hypothetically would travel from 2 miles away to try to get another mile to the east of me, they're probably going to have to come through here. So I'm looking at this farm and I'm like, man, this is, from a macro perspective, from the whole deal, and there's some other sweet looking spots in this general neighborhood, this is really where we need to be. And a lot of times you don't have the ability or the option to just pick a place based on that, but you want to understand in general the property you're hunting, or the property you're trying to decide on what to hunt, or even what to buy. I mean, good gracious, if you're going to buy a property, you got to understand, no matter how good it looks on a micro level, in a macro level, what are you going to be experiencing there? Whether it's travel in general, is there a lot of hunting pressure around you? Is there cover around? So you might have a bunch of cover right where you're at, but is there going to be areas of a bunch of food around you, or a lot of cover? So the macro perspective is really understanding how your property plays into the general scheme of the whitetails range. I'm hunting a 300-acre property here, and I can guarantee you that all of these bucks that I may be chasing or encountering this year, they're on other properties as well. Right. And it really gets drastic whenever you get into like I hunt eastern Kansas, and we're hunting long stretches of river bottom, not big blocks of timber. You might encounter a buck literally that summered and even has a core area that is 3-4 miles away, and he's looking for that hot doe, and he's using those really tiny, skinny little travel corridors to get from that one hot doe that one doe that he just bred to the next one he plans on breeding. So you want to understand how that property is playing into the overall scene around you. And then once you understand that and you make your decisions, we dive into the map a lot more, and we're really starting to think about food plot locations, habitat improvements, stand locations, access. These are our kind of, when you get into the micro level of how you're studying a map. So the map can tell you a lot from the overall scene of what's around you and how your property plays into that. And then from there, that the specific small details and intricacies of that specific property you're hunting, and how you're going to access and hunt specific wind wind directions on certain areas and crossings and funnels and where you're going to put your food plots and whatnot.
Right. So one thing you mentioned just made me think of, as you're talking about this, I'm just kind of thinking to myself how far things have come, how, 20 years ago, the ability to kind of have that kind of information at your fingertips about your neighborhood, and then just the down and dirty nitty gritty details of a property just weren't there. It was a lot of boots on the ground scouting, and there's still an element of that has to take place, of course. But, how much time do you think hunters are saved by being able to get a fair amount of detail, by scouting virtually before they even put boots on the ground? How much time do you think someone can save whenever they hit a new property, already kind of having a game plan in place? That way they're not starting from ground zero. I mean, it's got to be, hours, if not days worth of time that they save.
Yeah, and that all really depends on what they can hunt. If they're hunting a 20,000 acre piece of public ground, they decide, I'm going to take 1 week off and I'm going to head to, I don't know, you're going to head to another state and you're going to dive in deep to a specific piece of public ground. You're going to save a lot of time. You're going to spend a lot of time looking at that map, understanding, getting ahead of the game and trying to find these terrain funnels, these pinch points, these cover funnels, how you're going to access those places of maybe key stand locations. And you're going to really, once you get there, you're going to have a great idea of how that property lays. And then from there, you ground truth it. You're looking for sign. You're just going and hunting, and you're adjusting based off your observations. Yeah. The maps play a critical role, but at the end of the day, they're not going to hunt for you. You need to be able to go there and not necessarily, you're not going in blind, because you're using that map to understand how you're going to approach it. But for the guy who is going to hunt the same property without a map and see these terrain features and the aerial imagery to a guy that's going to hunt that same piece and just hit the ground and run, I would bet on the guy that's spending probably less time in the tree and more time with the map initially.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this year was my first experience, like I mentioned earlier, of looking at some out-of-state public land hunting in Ohio, and I spent a ton of time looking at maps before I ever got there, because I really only had a Saturday. As you know, living in Pennsylvania, it was I drove back home part way and picked up some buddies, and we headed the rest of the way out. So it was, 400, 500 mile round trip, or not round trip, but one-way trip for me roughly. And I knew I only had a Saturday to spend. So we got out there at 8 o'clock in the morning and scouted till 5. And we managed to scout a good bit of property because I had already looked at maps before I got out there. I kind of knew like the 7 or 8 locations I wanted to hit, and really kind of like give it a good once over to figure out, okay, what tree would I want to climb, look for deer sign. And I already kind of identified a lot of those land features you were mentioning, where you were saying, these are areas that deer like to travel, they like to use, whether they were saddles and draws. One was at the head of a drainage cut that ran down the side of a ridge. Which had great sign. Actually, the place I really am looking forward to hitting this year. So I think that, for me, it saved me probably days worth of time being able to look at maps in advance and get out there with a game plan. And actually, we'll see how good of a job I did here in a week and a half when I get out there.
Yeah, awesome, man. Well, best of luck to you. I definitely try to. There's a fine balance between hunting hard and hunting smart, and these maps, especially whenever you can look at a big piece of public ground, and if it's me and I'm hunting a piece of public ground, I'm going to try to find, regardless of interesting features that may be great for deer, first and foremost, the only thing I'm looking for is where are the most difficult places to get as a human being. Yeah. Because if you're hunting with other people, I want to be that guy that's willing to go the extra mile to get in deep to where there's going to be some unpressured whitetails. And then from there, I'm going to find the features deep in, how I'm going to get there without letting these other deer know, or even these other hunters know. How am I going to get in there and then attack that specific area? So that's exciting. I look forward to being able to get a little more time on the road in the years to come and pick out some public ground and really go after it kind of the way you are.
Yeah, it'll be. I'll give you a full report, let you know how it goes. Success or failure, either way. But I know you have. We've spent about an hour here together, and I want to be sensitive of your time. I know as the Phil and I both are, we're family men. There's always obligations along with that. But before we let you go, I wanted to see if you had any hunting story you'd like to share. I always like to kind of wrap things up with someone sharing a story of, you know, from the beginning of the hunt to the end of the hunt to the story around the tailgate, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, ironically, I'll tell this one. You guys are PA boys, and tonight I took my dog and my son for a little stroll around the neighborhood, and tonight reminded me exactly of the night I became a bow hunter, and that was, man, I think it would have been, I was 17 years old, and I was already in the stand before this with the bow, but the night I really became a bow hunter. My dad took me out, and it was probably right around now. It was the end of October, and there was a storm coming in, and we sat up on the end of this ridge, and basically where it started to drop down just a little bit on the end of this point. And we knew it was just prime conditions. It was awesome. We dealt with a bunch of warm weather the whole week, and it's like this front's coming in. We're fired up, you know. From the little I know about bow hunting whitetails, I know it's going to be a good night to sit. And we get up on the end of this ridge, and we're in this gnarly old oak tree. Just a cool, literally, I mean, I'm a big fan of the trees you actually sit in, too. Aside from where they're at, it's always cool to you know, look at the tree that you're in. But anyways, we're in this gnarly old oak tree, and this one branch is reaching way out over the edge, and it was just a cool spot. And anyways, this front's rolling in, the wind is picking up, it's starting to get nasty out, and it's getting dark fast, and we're basically the edge of this point. It kind of opens up, but it would be the southwest edge of that point. And it goes right along the contour of the ridge. It's just thick, really awesome thicket, and we're basically just hunting the end of it. And right there, getting close to last light, this big buck just rolls right up out of this thicket. And being from Pennsylvania, you know, I mean, I'm looking at this deer, I'm like, holy cow, like this deer's not even around here. He's a monster. And I just remember, I could tell right away when I saw his body, he just looked like a huge rectangle walking through. I mean, there was no question he was a buck without even seeing his rack. And anyways, my dad's sitting right there with me, and you know, I spotted him, and then I'm like, Dad, look at this buck coming. He's skirting the edge, and he's basically scent checking it seemed like he was scent checking the point of the ridge that we were hanging on, but thankfully we're high enough where our scent is blown off the back side of it. So he would have to get way around and then down the hill to be able to smell us. It'd be really tough. So it was a great setup. Anyways, he comes to the point, and my dad grunts at him. And this was really the first time, and this is the beginning really of my bow hunting career. So I've always grown up hunting in Pennsylvania where we're really not hunting the rut. We're rifle hunting or gun hunting, and you're seeing deer based on other people hunting those deer, shooting at them, you know. Right. So I'm watching this big buck, this big old son of a gun, and my dad grunts at him, and he just slammed on the brakes, and he bristled all up, and next thing you know, boom, here he comes, and he gets all stiff, and he's just posturing, coming up the end of that point, right up onto our laps, and this deer is and he's already big, and he's all fluffed up, and he just looks like he's ready to, you know, just crush whatever made that sound, you know. So I've got my bow in hand, and he comes right up at about 15, 16, 17 yards, and it's so open that I can't draw yet. I have to wait until he gets behind this one tree, and boom, right there, he slams on the brakes, and he looks right up at us. And I'll never forget my dad saying, "Close your eyes." So I did, because he was looking right at us. I didn't realize this, but when you look right at an animal, that sixth sense really kicks into high gear, and they're about fixing to get out. So I closed my eyes, and we both the wind is just ripping. It's awesome. And then once he started walking again, I remember just opening my eyes and my dad at the same time saying, draw. And it just was all one big smooth motion. And he got behind that tree and I drew on him. He was quartering away and I shot right where I was aiming. And unfortunately, being a rookie bow hunter, when he was quartering away, I didn't take into account, man, I got to aim a little bit farther back. So I drilled him right where I wanted to shoot him. But unfortunately, that was right on his shoulder blade,
right.
and it deflected off of him. So, this story doesn't end with a successful kill. So I shoot, and boom, it happens so fast, and it's dark, and he runs down over the hill off the ridge, and I just remember I just started shaking like uncontrollably, and I remember turning around and looking at my dad, and I just couldn't. I started laughing, and I couldn't even stop laughing. I'm just so happy and so excited with this new, literally like adrenaline like I've never felt in my entire life ripping through my body, and my dad was so pumped, and so that was really the night that I became a bow hunter, and I'll never ever forget that. And unfortunately, we tracked that thing for 1.5 miles, believe it or not. We ran out of blood 1.5 miles.
Wow.
I cut his shoulder open.
Wow.
He bled that far, and we got access to multiple properties that he got on. And he just quit bleeding, and it was a flesh wound. It was, we kept tracking because he was still bleeding, but that arrow told us that we probably weren't going to get him that night. But at the end of the day, I'm sure he lived on for another, another day. That was the most one of the most awesome times that I've ever experienced. And it's like the people that I don't meet, or the people that I meet that have never hunted before or bow hunted, it's like those are the times that you can really only get in the woods, So awesome stuff.
But that's a great first experience for bow hunting, man.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
Yeah, that's yeah, man, that's an awesome story. I mean, even though it didn't end with the harvest, man, I sometimes think some of the best stories are just exactly what you kind of described, or just those experiences that we'll not ever forget. Because I mean, every now and then you get that buck that you won't ever forget. But if you take, over the years, you take, many deer or whatever, and I don't want to say that they necessarily lose it's not that they lose their luster necessarily, but the ones that got away once in a while seem to stick with you just a little bit more. And maybe sometimes even are more important to your success and your growth as a bow hunter, I think, in the long term, which might be why we think about them and kind of romanticize about them as much as we do.
Yeah, Clint, they're called nightmares. The ones that get away, nightmares.
Yeah. But hey, Ben, I just want to say thanks for sharing some time with us. But before we let you go, do you want to share any of the places where folks might be able to find out more about Huntera Maps and what you guys are into?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for having me on the podcast. It was a great conversation with you. If anybody wants to find out more about what we do at Huntera, it's www.huntera.com. It's HUNTERRA.com. We've got Facebook page, Instagram page, and a YouTube account that we're pretty active with. And if anybody wants to follow just my personal hunting, my hunting stuff, I do a good bit of content on Instagram. Just my name at Ben Harshyne. So, yeah, that's how you guys get a hold of me. And good luck this season to you.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Everyone out there, go check out Huntera Maps. You won't be disappointed. They got some great stuff on their site and certainly have a lot of content to share. Ben, again, just want to thank you for hopping on and sharing some time with us, and good luck to you in Iowa. I'll be kind of keeping up with you via social media and so forth, hoping to see a big deer down here at some point.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
All right, that is a wrap for today, folks. We'd like to thank Ben for joining us, and if you'd like to learn more about Huntera and all their offerings, please visit huntera.com. Also, feel free to give them a follow across all their social media platforms. You can find each of those links in the show notes in the blog post. Also would like to give a big thank you to our partners at Exodus, and a big thank you to all of you who continue to tune in each week. Very much appreciated that you guys decide to spend an hour of your day every other week with us. Much appreciated for that. If you're enjoying the content of the podcast, please feel free to subscribe to the podcast via iTunes, Stitcher, and you can also listen to us on Google Play. And if you are enjoying the podcast, please feel free to leave us a 5-star iTunes rating. We'd be very much appreciative of that. And until next time, we'll see y'all.